ultimately there's only one question that matters when we're trying to discern God's direction in our lives. And that is, at any given moment, in every situation, that question is, God, what are you asking me to do now? And then we listen. And when we hear, then there's really only one response that matters. And that is, I will continue to commit to live my life as an unqualified yes to whatever you ask me to do.
Dr. Taylor, it's such an honor to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And you are wrapping up your 45 years of ministry in education service. I mean, that's huge. And
it's a long time, isn't it?
It's a long time, but a lot of good and I guess a lot of ups and downs, you know, and I'm excited to hear all of that. But obviously your journey didn't start with you being the president of Evangel University, although you're ending there, right?
Although I did start at Evangel as a student.
Did
right?
you? Wow, the full circle. That's exciting. And I'm just curious how God led you through that 45 years of leadership in education. How did God call you and brought you to where you're at today?
Well, you're right. So 45 years is a long time. So when you first said 45 years, I thought of Moses in the wilderness and wandering around. And, you know, it's interesting how it is we come to discover what our calling is. And for me, it actually began at Evangel as a student. And students have heard me tell this story before, but it was one of those pivotal moments in my life. I had many professors that were so influential in my life, but one of them was Dr. Van Zant. I was an education major, elementary education major, and I took several courses with him in psychology, and he was just this extraordinary teacher. But he'd been a pastor before. And up until that point, I'd kind of grown up in a church that viewed, if you were called, if you had a calling of God on your life, you needed to be in a church or on a mission field. It was a pretty narrow view of vocational calling. And one day I was in his office and got the courage up to ask him a personal question. So can I ask you a personal question? And he said, well, you can ask. That's sometimes what I say to students now when they ask a person, can I ask you a personal? You can ask, right? Yeah. I'll decide whether. Anyway, so my question to him was, and I had puzzled over this because he'd been a pastor. So my question was, why did you leave the ministry to become a professor?
That's a good question.
Right? Because if you were called to be a minister, shouldn't that be in a pulpit or in a church? And to this day, I can still almost visualize him sitting behind his desk, leaning forward, putting his hands on the desk and saying, oh, Carol, I never left the ministry. And then here was the line that I have obviously never forgotten all these years later. God just changed the shape of my pulpit.
Oh, I love that.
And then we had this, wonderful conversation about calling, and that really the goal of our life is to live our life in total surrender to whatever it is God calls us to do. And at any time, God can change the shape of what that pulpit looks like. So for him, he was still every much in ministry as he was when he pastored a church, and impacting lives in extraordinary ways. And so in each of the, so you're probably aware, I spent the first 25 years of that calling in public education, and just the last 20 years in Christian higher education. And at each pivot or turn, from starting as an elementary school teacher in a Greek Orthodox school, of all things, in Chicago, to coming back and doing a master's degree at what was then AGGS, because I was really trying to discern if I was being called to full-time missions. And at the end of that, the answer for me at least was clear. Yes, you have a mission field, but it's going to be different. And so then I spent a number of years at state universities working with international students, and then in the world of testing. And so at each of those points, the question was, God, are you preparing to change the shape of the pulpit? And that was the question I asked then, moving from public education to Christian higher education. The question that I sat in, and I still remember the day I made the decision that I would go to Evangel University first in California. And that was, the question in my mind was, could the experiences that you've allowed me to have in the marketplace be of value to Christian higher education? So, and I encourage students today, at some point we come to realize and understand, I think, that ultimately there's only one question that matters when we're trying to discern God's direction in our lives. And that is, at any given moment, in every situation, that question is, God, what are you asking me to do now? And then we listen. And when we hear, then there's really only one response that matters. And that is, I will continue to commit to live my life as an unqualified yes to whatever you ask me to do. And if we can choose to live into that, I think for each of us, we could never quite imagine the journey that God had planned for us. So if you'd asked me when I was an undergraduate student at Evangel, one day you'll come back and be the president, I would have laughed. And, I wasn't even thinking of graduate school at that time. But if you just keep saying yes to the next opportunity and the next door with the question, God, what are you asking me to do? You could end up with an adventure you hadn't imagined when you're 20.
Wow, your story is such a testament to God's faithfulness, and I can see how our obedience can help us fulfill God-sized tasks, those daunting tests and big mountains. But to watch you walk through that journey, it's just so inspiring and empowering.
Maybe on a good day, yeah.
I want to see you on bad days and see how you handle it. I think that would be a great learning lesson too, right? Well, as an organizational leader, you certainly understand the dynamics of leading organizations through changes, and sometimes including crises. And so, when it comes to leadership, organizational leadership, that is just kind of part of it, right? The change is always constant. You can't not make it not happen. It's just part of what it is. So what are some of the principles and practices that you've learned and applied in your own walks of life that ministers like myself can apply in my own ministry context, whatever the platform that may be?
Yeah. So perhaps not surprisingly, I've actually thought about that over the years, because you're right. I mean, you step into a challenging opportunity, and it comes with a job description. Here are the expectations, here are the goals, here's what we are expecting of you in this. And then things happen, always, and you say, now that's not in the job description, right? And so you're right, change is a part of life for all of us. Whether you're in a leadership role or you're just living daily life, change happens. We like to think we're in control, and then life happens and we get reminded actually we're not. I mean, the current pandemic is a good example of that, right? Yeah, who had a roadmap for this one? None of us. So actually I've embraced, I actually jotted them down because I knew you were going to ask the question. So the first one is, you've got to commit to the journey. You've got to be all in. You can't lead if you've got one foot out the door. Like, okay, we'll take the next 5 steps forward, but if this isn't panning out, I've got an exit strategy. There's no exit strategy. You've got to be all in. The second one is, you always have to confront reality. Like, give me the brutal facts. But you've got to be able to find a way to confront reality with hope. And not hope that's pie in the sky, or we're just going to be positive thinkers, but genuine hope that is that confident expectation that God has a plan. You may not know it, but He's in the midst of it with you. So the notion that you've got to deal with the facts, you've got to deal with reality, but you have to do it with a sense of hope, or those you lead won't have hope either. That's right. So my third one is, you have to lead with a third-class ticket. And there's a story behind that one. And actually, I have framed on the wall of my office an authentic third-class stagecoach ticket. But it's the realization that you lead not from a place where you don't get your own hands messy. You're with people. You lead the team by your own example. So if you're asking people to make sacrifices and changes or be generous in some way, you have to do it first.
Yes.
right?
Model
And,
it.
always, and model it. So the idea of embracing a third-class ticket, realizing whatever organization or ministry that you're leading does not exist as your next stepping stone, does not exist to make you famous, does not exist to promote your ministry. That organization exists so that you can serve them. And so that's the idea of the third-class ticket. The fourth is you got to expect it's going to get messy. You know, we have this, you know, sometimes you see these diagrams of leadership and project plans, and they look so nice and clean. We go from point A to point B, and then eventually the project is done. In reality, leadership's not that way, life isn't that way. So you're going this way, and then it all gets tangled up, and then you go forward, and then it all gets tangled up, and then you go backwards, and then you go forwards. And the goal is not to get stuck in the tangled mess, but to understand when you lead, it's going to get messy at times. And so just be prepared for that. And then it's the sequence of finding why, who, and how in that order. It's also, you've got to find your own inspiration. So there's a lot of literature about perseverance, about grit, and that's essential in life as well as leadership. But there's got to be something beyond just, I'm a person who doesn't give up, that in those darkest moments when you can't see any way forward, you've got to find, or when you can't find it, trust that God will give you the inspiration that you need to keep going. And then the other is the idea of embracing change. We live by the motto, especially now, blessed are the flexible.
Yes, that's
You've
true.
got to find a way to keep perspective, because if you're in the thick of it, it's really easy to only see what's right here. And so having strategies for how you'll step out of that to be able to gain and keep perspective. Whenever you're leading through difficult situations and crises or change, there will be losses. And so embracing the notion that not only is it okay, but it's essential to grieve the losses that occur along the way. And then finally, and perhaps the most important one of all, is you have to choose to lead with love. Yeah. So those are my top 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can almost hear people like taking notes and their fingers on fire. Well, those are really great principles just for life in general too. Like, stick to the plan, have the grit, lead people with love.
And then change your plan.
Change a plan. Yeah. Yes, your life goes on. You're going to have to adapt, adjust, be flexible.
So I think, following up on that about planning, I think it was President Eisenhower who was quite the hero during World War II, made the statement that plans are pretty useless, but planning is indispensable. So the notion that because if we make a plan and say, here's the plan, if we're not open to adjusting it, changing it along the way, we could end up dead. There's a great story that Stephen Covey told in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I looked it up last week again. And I'm so old, I actually read it and still have my first print edition, which was like 1989, when the first book came out. But he has this great story that he tells that I think underscores the need for flexibility and embracing change. And it's the story of there were 2 ships that were doing maneuvers out in, I think it was in the Atlantic Ocean, and really rough weather, and it got really, really foggy. And whoever was on deck called the captain and said, we're on a collision course. We can see a light out here. And the captain said, well, signal, change course 20 degrees starboard. So they signal where the light is. Message comes back, you change course 20 degrees starboard. Captain says, Captain comes up on the deck and says, no, you change course 20 degrees starboard. Message comes back, suggest you change course 20 degrees starboard. Signal, I'm the captain of this ship. Who are you? Signal comes back, seaman first class, change course 20 degrees. Captain now is really, really angry. You signal him, I'm a battleship. Signal comes back, I'm the lighthouse. So guess who changed course, right? Yeah. Right. So the notion that as you get new information, you've got to be willing to like adapt your plans and be flexible. But I mean, it's a great example of like, we think it's all set, and then we get some new information, which is why keep the facts in front of you, and you've got to be willing to flex and change.
Wow, great analogy. So memorable. It will stick in my mind for a long time.
All these years, I still remember it.
Yes. Well, one of the lists that you said earlier, it kind of stood out to me, and I would like you to expound on that. You said you have to identify the why, the who, and the how in that sequence. Yes. So can you expound on it a little bit?
Sure.
What do you mean by that?
So the why is all about what's the vision? Why do you exist? So especially in a challenging time, if you don't have a clear sense of why you're doing this, why your organization exists, and why it would be a loss in the world if it ceased to exist, that's where the inspiration and motivation comes from, right? So great, and actually it was Simon Sinek who gave the example. And so if you think of Martin Luther King Jr., who was more inspiring? And this great speech that he gave standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he did not inspire a nation to embrace the need for change in the civil rights movement by saying, now, brothers and sisters, I have a plan. What he said was, I have a dream. Right? I have a dream. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. So what he cast was a vision of a dream that was so powerful that it inspired a nation. Now, he also had plans, but that's not what inspires people. Your strategic plan is like how you're going to get from here to there, how you're going to adapt it as you get there, but it's not your reason for being. It's the reason you exist that inspires people to join you, to follow, to work together towards that vision. So for us at Evangel, that vision has always been, in fact, Evangel means good news, right? It means, so I've often said we're the Good News University. That vision has always been about equipping men and women to live into their callings and equipping them to do that as the presence of Christ in the world. And if ever our world needed men and women in every area of calling, certainly in pulpits, on the mission field, but also in hospitals and places of public service and in public schools. And I mean, you go on and on and on. And that's the reason that Evangel exists. So you have to start with the vision, right? That then motivates us to keep going. And then who has to come next. So you can't get there alone, right? So who's the team that you're going to work with? And to take care in identifying what's needed and who fits that need. And when I look for building a team, I look for those same, I look first for, can you be all in on this? I need to know if things get rough that you're not going to hit the exit and run. We've got to be all in. So, and think, what did Christ do when he started his ministry? Pick 12, right? Sometimes we'll ask, like, why those 12, right? But he, as the Gospels went on, we saw why those 12. And then you think, now how are we going to get there? Right? But you've got to have the right team to be able to take the journey.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Yeah. Wow. Another thing, as an organizational leader and leaders in ministry, you kind of mentioned about leading through griefs and grieving the changes and all that, the crisis. You're not just leading organization through changes, you're also leading people who are going through changes. And the kicker is everybody grieves differently. And the more people you lead, the more dynamics of people's personalities and how they deal with changes. So how can we lead as people of God and leaders in ministry? How can we lead them as we face each challenge and change?
That's a big question.
It is.
But I think you're asking, like, what do you do about the grief part of it? Because so institutions are not buildings. I mean, this is a beautiful space that we're in today, but it's the people that are here that are living into the mission, that's the institution. The institution's always the people. and it really, where this really became one of the principles that I embraced was actually when I was at Evangel University. And you know some of the story there of the crisis that Vanguard went through. And it was really messy, and it was really noisy, and things were changing, and change is hard, and people were grieving. And I was who else went through like transformational change and it was hard? Well, Nehemiah is a good book to read on that, right? How you rebuild something. And also Ezra, right? And if you read Ezra's accounting of rebuilding the temple, you get to, it's actually in chapter 3, where it says, so they've laid the foundation, right? And people are rejoicing. So you're reading along, and Ezra writes about how they're praising, they're giving thanks, you know, they're yelling out, he's good, his love endures forever. And then there's this little change, and it says, but there were these old priests and Levites who remembered what it was, and they began to weep and wail. And then Ezra writes, it was so loud that you could hear it a long ways off, and you couldn't distinguish the shouts of joy from the weeping. And I remembered reading that at that time and thinking, people need space to grieve. And you get the shouts of joy and the weeping kind of intermingled at the same time. And people grieve differently. So to allow people, not that they need our permission, but to allow people the space to grieve in the way that they grieve, without saying, like, get on with it. Like, you know, the future's going to be a lot better. So, you know, that's that. This is now like, let's move forward. But grief is an important part of life. You know, Lamentations, you know, lament. I mean, how many of our psalms are psalms of lament? We don't often hear sermons on the spiritual discipline of lament. And perhaps the best model of that is Christ himself. You think of the times that he went away to a solitary place, how he wept over Jerusalem. And then when he goes to see his friends after their brother dies, how did he grieve with them? You know, he could have shown up to, you know, Lazarus. Now, he knew what was going to happen. I mean, he delayed going for the very purpose of, he knew Lazarus would be in the tomb, he'd already be smelling bad, and he's going to call him out. So it's going to be this magnificent miracle. And here are these two sisters. And he does not greet them with, okay, buck up, gals. You know, you have no idea what's about to happen, so like, he didn't preach at them. He didn't, I mean, they knew that Lazarus was in a good place. What does Scripture say? He wept, knowing full well what he was going to do. So I mean, isn't he our perfect model? Yes. That if someone is in pain and grieving, the invitation is, if you want to be my presence with them, sit down and weep with them, grieve with them. You may move forward, but not if you haven't wept with them. You know, there are times when I think the two most comforting words in Scripture that often as kids we memorize, where we need to memorize 5 verses. I want to memorize the verse Jesus wept, right? It's nice and tight and short, right. And I can check off. I memorized another verse. Funny. But there are times when those 2 words, that shortest verse, are the most comforting words that we can hear. You know, we have a Savior who knows what it means to suffer and grieve. And yet with hope, yes. Right?
And that's how exactly you model leadership as you lead people. I've seen you grieve with people in their situation, you know, dark places. You visited them, you pray with them, you pastored them. You're not just saying this, I've seen you do it. So thank you for leading by example. And I feel like this conversation is so inspiring, but it's a beginning of the rest of the conversation that we're going to have with other fellow ministers. Perhaps your new pulpit is this, you know, just pouring out, who knows. But thank you for your not just 45 years of ministry and education, but lifetime of your service and dedication and love that you share. You really love people, and I can see that. You cannot fabricate that. And so thank you for loving people around you, and thank you so much for this conversation.
Well, and thank you for everything you do and how well you lead and serve. And maybe in 45 years I'll interview you.
Oh,
no,
thank you.
I'll be in heaven by then.
You wait till then, okay? You wait till then. But thank you, Dr. Taylor. We love you.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Likewise.